Holy God, bless us as we continue to ponder our history collectively as a nation, our history as Christians, our history as church, and in our history as children of God who belong to the entire human race. Bless our conversations, we pray in Christ's name, amen. So we're on chapters 4 and 5 of Jemar Tisby's book, The Color of Compromise. We've seen 3 videos. Jenny did one in the introductory session in the first week. Pastor John was last week, and that was making race in the colonial era, how things started out, in this nation and racial issues. And the other second chapter he had, chapter 3, Understanding Liberty in the Age of Revolution and Revival. And my responsibility for today is chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 is Institutionalizing Race in the Antebellum Era and Understanding Liberty in the Age of Revolution and, Defending Slavery at the Onset of the Civil War. And we've got a fair amount of video this time. The first one is a little over 24 minutes, and the second one is 20 minutes. So I'm not going to belabor things at much length at all here. But I will say, anybody got a clue what antebellum means? And if you want to say something, go, Jane.
Before war.
Very good. Jane knows.
I looked it up. I cheated.
I did too. It means a period of time before a particular war, but in this nation, it has generally been understood as the period of time before the Civil War would be sort of from the tail end of the 18th century or right at the turn of the century, 1800 to 1860s. And I don't know what you think of when you think of antebellum, but it, the word is fondly viewed by a lot of folks. It's sort of romanticized, Gone with the Wind, earnest gentlemen, honorable gentlemen, earnest religion, delicate Southern belles, happy blacks content with their bondage. Yes, Mr. Jones. Yes, Mr. Jones. So happy, Mr. Jones, kind of. And that's what antebellum generates for a lot of people. Some of you may know that there's a group, music group called Lady Antebellum, which has actually changed its name as they've discovered that the word is actually offensive to African Americans and those of African descent. So that's a little introduction. So I'm just gonna do my screen share and see if I can actually accomplish this. Always makes me nervous when I start doing these things. Get my video. There it is. It's okay. I've got it. See if I get back to my screen share. Make sure I do the video. All right, here we go.
In 1809, St. Philip's becomes the first Black Episcopal parish in New York City. It attracted the city's leading Black citizens. But even though it had the cream of the crop, so to speak, it still wasn't enough to gain an equal standing with their white Episcopalian brethren. At the 1846 annual convention, leaders of St. Philip's applied for admission, which would give them full standing and equal footing with white Anglican churches. The decision got handed down from the all-white governing body, and it said neither St. Philip's nor any other colored congregation will be admitted into union this convention so as to entitle them to representation therein. Why? Why did the committee make this decision? They said, and I quote, "They are socially degraded and are not regarded as proper associates for the class of person who attend our convention." Now here's the kicker. They also said, "We object not to the color of the skin, but we question their possession of those qualities which would render their intercourse with the members of a church convention useful." In other words, they weren't racist, is what they were trying to say, even though they were excluding St. Philip's purely on the fact that it was a congregation of black people. The racism is not remarkable. What's remarkable is that black people didn't abandon the faith altogether. The black church began developing its own distinctive practices and a theology that spoke to both spiritual, immediate, and physical liberation. Remarkably, black Christianity grew alongside the explosive expansion of slavery. In fact, it was their faith in God that helped black believers survive and resist their enslavement. Now, at the outset of the 19th century, when the new nation, these United States, could have become a beacon for diversity and equality, they chose instead to expand the practice of enslavement. It's again this idea of contingency. It didn't have to be this way, but people chose a direction. In the antebellum era, racism became further embedded in America's foundations and even within American churches. So let's go back to the nation's founding documents. Let's look at the Constitution. In 1787, nation's leaders hold the Constitutional Convention, and they outlined what became the U.S. Constitution, and it stands to this day as the founding document outlining the ideals and function of the United States of America. What's interesting is that the Constitution never used the word slave or slavery, but it's still a pro-slavery document. Historian David Waldeskyer said of the 84 clauses in the Constitution, 6 directly concerned slavery, 5 others had implications for slavery. So here's an example. Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution is known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. And it says, "No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, exiting into another, shall be discharged from such service or labor." What that meant in practice was that there was no place that was safe for enslaved Africans. Even if they escaped to freedom, they could be recaptured and sent back to enslavement. And sometimes, even if they were already free black persons, because they were black, they could still be captured without cause and sent back and into enslavement. There's also something called the 3/5 clause. That's Article 1, Section 2. It refers to representation in Congress, and what they said in the Constitution is that representation shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, in other words, indentured servants, and excluding Indians who were not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. That all other persons is code for enslaved Africans. And this is known as the 3/5 compromise. There's another compromise called the Dirty Compromise. After ratification of the Constitution, you couldn't discuss abolishing the slave trade for another 20 years, or the states of Georgia and South Carolina threatened not to pass the Constitution at all. So the compromise was, we'll table it for another 2 decades, and that's called the Dirty Compromise. In 1808, Congress finally ceases the transatlantic slave trade to the United States. That means that shipment from West Africa to parts of North America, that was abolished, but it didn't abolish the practice of slavery itself. Those were 2 separate issues. Now, there were a lot of other compromises that went along with the growth and practice of slavery in this burgeoning United States. One of them is called the Missouri Compromise. That word just keeps coming up again, doesn't it? Compromise. It's always at the expense of enslaved people, too. So in 1820, the government admits Missouri as a slave state, but only on the condition that they admit Maine as a free state to preserve the balance of power, slave and free existing at the same time. And basically, it effectively guaranteed that slavery would remain an American institution for the next several decades. Early legislation protected, or at least did not dismantle, race-based slavery. And so that's the Constitution, that's the political structure of the United States. But what about the church? Well, similar compromises are happening with white supremacy and slavery at crucial points early on in U.S. history. One of the things you got to understand about slavery is the Chattel Principle. So chattel means property. James W.C. Pennington, he was a minister and an abolitionist, a black man, said this: "The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle, and the cart whip, the starvation, and nakedness are its inevitable consequences." One book that really brings home this idea of the chattel principle is by Walter Johnson, and it's called Soul by Soul. In that book, Dr. Johnson says the entire economy of the antebellum South was constructed on the idea that the bodies of enslaved people had a measurable monetary value. Enslaved Africans were valued for their physical strength, for their reputation for obedience. They were property, so they were used as collateral for loans and even handed down from parents to children as an inheritance. Now, because they were treated as property, any ties of family could be severed at absolutely any moment. There were more than 600,000 interstate sales of enslaved Africans. Historians estimate that 25% of those sales destroyed a first marriage, and that 50% broke up a nuclear family, and also that children, even under the age of 13, were sold away from their parents. Under the chattel principle, men and women were treated differently. You see, men were valued for their productive labor, what they could do in the fields or the factory or whatever it might be. Black women were valued not only for their productive ability, but for their reproductive ability as well. And it was harsh. So black women were expected to work in the fields all throughout their pregnancy, right up to the moment of giving birth. And then they didn't have much time to convalesce. They didn't have much time to take care of their baby. There was no such thing as maternity leave. They were expected to quickly go back to work. Not only that, they were expected to raise their own children, labor alongside the men, and also oftentimes to raise children of their enslavers as well. So black women had the double duty of doing all the work of an enslaved person, but also being expected to reproduce and thereby grow the workforce for the plantation owner. Unfortunately, another aspect of life as a black enslaved woman was rape. And it was almost inevitable for many black women. White mistresses, other women who you could perhaps expect some gender solidarity from, they proved of no help as well. They were complicit in this. Enslavers had almost absolute legal authority over their property, so black women and their families and the people who cared about them had absolutely no recourse. We know there's stories of enslaved women through narratives like the one that Harriet Jacobs wrote called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She writes about how she tried to avoid the lascivious advances of Dr. Flint, her owner, and the choice she had to make between succumbing to Dr. Flint or, on another hand, there was a free white man who was interested in her, and perhaps she should go with him because if they had children together, perhaps this free white man would allow his children to be free. Ultimately, Harriet Jacobs decides not to be raped, but to willingly give herself to this white man, this free white man, mainly for the sake of her children. But Harriet Jacobs is a faithful Christian woman. She only wants to be married to someone who loves her and to raise her children the way she thinks that Scripture teaches, the way her grandmother, who's a Christian, teaches. And so, as she's writing this narrative of her life, she directly addresses women who are reading it. And she says, "But O ye happy women, whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, who have been free to choose the objects of your affection, whose homes are protected by law, do not judge the poor, desolate slave girl too severely." You see, these are the kind of impossible choices that Black women faced under slavery. American Christians largely chose to turn a blind eye to things like family separation and the scarring of bodies and starvation of stomachs, rape, and generational trauma that happened with enslavement. The Bible speaks of love of neighbor, and however individual Christians may have personally felt about the practice of slavery, not enough people did enough to fight it. Instead, they were complicit with the continuation of slavery. But even as so many white Christians were complicit with the status quo of slavery, there was resistance and rebellion. Enslaved Black people were victimized, but they were not victims. See, so far we focused a lot on white racism and complicity with racism, but we also have to recognize the strength and resilience of Black people in the face of crushing attempts at dehumanization. Black people did not passively accept their enslavement. They resisted it by any means available to them. So this resistance took multiple forms. For instance, they deliberately broke tools to delay the work. They would set fires at various spots on the plantation. Others would pretend to be sick and so get out of work. Some even feigned mental slowness to make them seem less capable. Other enslaved people, they stole food or other items as compensation for all this unpaid labor that they were doing. Even learning to read was a form of resistance. Now, there are other forms that are a bit more obvious. For instance, escape. But escape was extremely risky. If you failed, you could get a beating at best, or mutilation, or even death at the worst. And it's gendered here too, because men were more able to escape because women were expected to care for children. It's a lot harder to run for freedom when you've got children in tow than when you're solo. But enslaved people would make up songs and they would encode messages of liberation into these songs. Songs like "Steal Away to Jesus" were often sung when it was time to escape, or "Follow the Drinking Gourd." Embedded in this song were directions that enslaved people could follow to freedom. Now, escape was one form of resistance. Another, and probably the most obvious and rare form, was outright rebellion. It's the most ambitious, it's the most risky form of resistance. But enslaved people in North America actually got inspiration from people in Haiti. Enslaved Africans in Haiti waged the first successful slave revolution of the modern Atlantic world from 1781 to 1804, and they resisted the rule of white Europeans. And as the news spread, it inspired enslaved Africans all over the world. And it caused fear among plantation owners and white people who always suspected a slave revolt might be brewing. Sometimes they were right. Denmark Vesey was a Black man. He was born into slavery, and he literally won the lottery and bought his freedom for $600. But something that always vexed him was the fact that he couldn't purchase his wife and children. And so he never gave up the pursuit of freedom, not only for himself, but for them as well. In the year 1817, he joined Emmanuel AME in Charleston and became a leader in the church. A few years later, in 1822, partially inspired by the Haitian Revolution, he planned a massive slave revolt. Now, before they could actually start the revolt, another enslaved person gave away the plans to white people, and then Vesey, along with more than 30 other suspects, were executed. And as punishment, they also burned Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church to the ground. Several years later, in 1828, a man named Nat Turner, also an enslaved black person, wrote about his inspiration to rebel. He said that God would make known to him by signs in the heavens that he should commence the great work, and that I should arise and prepare myself and slay my enemies with their own weapons. And he did just that. On August 21st, 1831, the moon eclipsed the sun, and Nat Turner took it as a divine sign. It was time to rebel. So Turner and 6 followers entered the house of a slaveholder and murdered the entire family in their sleep. He and his band moved on to other homes and did the same thing. His followers grew, and by the end, around 55 white men, women, and children had died by their hands. They were captured on October 30th and executed on November 11th. But it didn't end there. You see, in response, the white community killed more than 100 black people, sometimes just indiscriminately. And they also created harsher laws about mobility and assembly. You see, white Christians and others didn't want black people getting together, because when black folks got together, they plotted escape. They talked about freedom. They talked about liberty. And so Christians, white Christians, eventually basically came to practice a paternalistic and pro-slavery form of Christianity. White enslavers wanted to control black bodies and black expressions of Christianity. And so this paternalistic Christianity monitored and chose what was acceptable in black worship and congregations. Historian Charles F. Irons wrote The Origins of Pro-Slavery Christianity. And he indicates that prior to the Civil War, many blacks and whites, they worshiped together in the same congregation. Of course, it was a means of controlling the belief of black people and to prevent the insurrection of black people. And so this is paternalism. It comes from the idea that a slave plantation is basically an extended household. That household is headed by a man who is this benevolent patriarch. That's the slave master. And it views in this plantation household enslaved black people as children. And they're part of the patriarch's household, but they're perpetual children. They needed protection and discipline and guidance, and they could never actually grow into full independence as a parent would actually hope their child would if they truly loved them. Now, you can see paternalism at work in some of the institutions that Christians created. One was called the American Colonization Society. And basically, their whole goal was to relocate black people back to Africa. Now, some people wanted to go back. This sounds good, right? Let's escape from the enslavement and the racism and the white supremacy of the United States. Let's go back to our homeland in Africa and start a society there. Sounds good, right? Well, there's some paternalism embedded even in that notion. It's based on an assumption articulated by a guy named Robert Finley. And he said at the time, we should be cleared of them, meaning black people, and that black people would never be ready for the demands of democracy. Furthermore, the African Colonization Society basically thought that people who remained in Africa, that they had to be civilized through contact with other African people who were now civilized because of their interactions with Europeans. So you see the paternalism going on there. Yeah, go back to Africa because 1, we get rid of you in the United States. 2, you could never really have your full freedom here anyway. And 3, you can go civilize those other people on the continent of Africa because you've been around Europeans now. That was some of the paternalism that Christians practiced toward people of African descent. Now, we've talked about a great revival, but there was a second great revival, or the second great awakening. These are massive conversions. For instance, the Cane Ridge Revival, which occurred in Kentucky in 1801, 20 to 30,000 people attended, historians estimate. And it was also called America's Pentecost. It's just this dramatic outpouring of faith and conversion. There's the growth in this time of the idea of post-millennialism. And it became popular, and what it basically meant was that Jesus would return, but only after Christians ushered in this era of peace and justice. And so what that did was inspire Christians to these justice movements, and including abolition. But there were other cares like orphan care, prohibition, care for widows and the poor. And yet, even in the midst of this, even as Christians labored for peace and justice in these areas, they still compromised with racism. So Cane Ridge Revival, America's Pentecost, it was still segregated by race, which is ironic because in the biblical Pentecost in Acts 2, people are speaking in different languages, and folks from all languages and tribes are being gathered together, and yet at America's Pentecost, they're still being split apart by race. A famous revivalist preacher, to give another example, is Charles Finney. He was president of Oberlin College. Now, Oberlin is unique because it was the first to accept women and the first to accept black people. And Charles Finney was an abolitionist. So you would think this is an ally. This is somebody who's helping black people. To a point. You see, Charles Finney, he wasn't a fan of so-called social integration of the races. So he advocated abolition. He wanted black people to go to school at his college, and he even excluded white slave owners from membership in his congregation. But within that same congregation, he segregated black worshipers in the pews. Members who were black could not hold office. So social reform, he thought, would happen through individual conversion, not institutional or social reform. And that mindset, this fixation on individual conversion to the exclusion of changing policies and practices related to race, continues to be one of the stark dividing lines along race and ideology within the church. Within the antebellum period, what we're seeing is that compromise continues. In this time, the black church grew, and it served as a source of strength and resistance for black people. Rebellion and resistance also grew among black people as they tried to escape from slavery or plot rebellions to gain their own freedom. And yet, at the same time, slavery becomes further embedded in American culture. And evangelical Christianity, it's becoming more mainstream, but it continues to have this strained, tense relationship with race and justice. Churches compromised their prophetic voice in the culture by acquiescing to the system of slavery and white supremacy. Competing understandings of freedom, equality, and belonging in both the country and the congregation would one day soon explode into the Civil War.
Well, a lot to absorb in this lesson about this antebellum period. I think a couple things to ponder talking about. One is sort of the development of our Constitution, and its, if you will, difference from the initially stated noble ideals of the Declaration of Independence, which starts off, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and entitled to, among others, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And what happened between then and the development of the Constitution? Or was it just really not intended? Conversation about the church. I'll talk a little bit, or ask you to converse a little bit about chattel slavery, because I think it's really important to understand what that actually means. Some conversation about resistance and rebellion, paternal Christianity, language about the way the church acted, the conversation about great revivals, but things that stood out to you, things that you'd like to reflect on, or questions you would like to ask about about Kisby's presentation. And if you want to use your reaction, raise your hand. That will help us or help me. Who's good? Ernie, go ahead. Nope, you need to unmute.
My wife just told me that. I think it's important that we recognize that during this antebellum period was a huge growth in the American economy. After the Revolution, the War of 1812, our economy grew and it was largely based on the profits from slavery. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution, first in England, and growing cotton was very much demanded by the mills and so on of England. And then we developed our own mills in New England. So the whole part of the United States at that time was profiting by the slaveholding and the products of what the enslaved people were doing. And I think we need to all, in a sense, accept that somehow we have benefited by that growth during that time.
Yeah, excellent point, Ernie. I've mentioned in a sermon before the book I had to read, as we were doing the slavery audit at the seminary, and called "The Half Has Never Been Told." And the byline of the title of the book is slavery and the development of American capitalism, and everybody participated in it. If you bought a cotton shirt in a tailor's shop in Boston, you were participating in what was going on. This woven through the economy of the nation through those years. I saw Joe Norton.
One of the things that kind of hits me beyond all the economy and the money and everything is the harsh reality of probably mental illness with the slaves. The reason I'm saying that is because what hits me the most on all that, as a parent, I can't even imagine my child being taken away from me and then never to know what's happening to them or to see them. And I know it would pretty much destroy me for the rest of my life. And I'm thinking, these people, how often that harsh. I mean, I could choke up thinking about how would you deal with that? How on and on and on. It was just such a gut wrenching, awful thing. Beat me to death, but do not do anything with my child. And to think that these people had to carry on and still go on with life with such, it pains me beyond how I can explain it.
Yeah, Anne, and then I see Carolyn Dennis.
To build exactly on what, that was a great lead-in, Joe, because I was thinking the same thing. I kept thinking about the way the message that the enslaved people were given every day, thousands of times a day. You're only worth three-fifths of a person. You are property. You have value for your labor or your ability to reproduce. I mean, I keep thinking about the women that were raped so that they could, it's like they were a factory. They were treated like a factory, like you could make more. And you weren't paying for them, but the women were paying with their bodies and their lives. And then to have to deliver in the fields and then go back to work the next day after they've delivered a baby is just, gives me goosebumps to just, I can't wrap my head around it even today.
I think his encouragement to understand chattel slavery, sometimes we think slavery is slavery. And there are all kinds of forms of slavery, enslavement out of which you can buy yourself. Chattel slavery means it's forever, for the most part. Some people could buy their freedom, some were given freedom, clearly. But it meant your children and your children's children were enslaved. And you were indeed property. You know, you had slaves, they could be inherited by your children or by your nieces and nephews or by your grandchildren. They were, I mean, the property nature and the dehumanization, and for me, the idea of families, you know, they had no meaning for the slaves. You know, we decide we want to sell somebody for a good profit. Too bad if your wife and kids stay here. And some slaves ended up marrying again 20 years later because they figured they would never see their first spouse again. If anybody's ever seen 12 Years a Slave, it's a powerful and somewhat brutal movie, but it's a story of Solomon Northrop, who was a free man in Washington, D.C., was kidnapped by two con men and sold into slavery. He was a free man and sold into slavery, and because blacks had no standing in the court, he couldn't fight it. And the brutality that's envisioned in that movie will give you just the tiniest glimpse of the dehumanization. And the interesting thing is, you know, slave trade was abolished in 1807 because it was self-sustaining. 4 million slaves, with no problem getting more. Carolyn, Dennis, I see a hand up.
Yeah, I keep thinking in taking this class that there's a book that our daughter gave us at Christmas time. It's called White Too Long, and it's by Robert P. Jones. And it's about, actually, it's about the South. Well, not just the South, but the church's reaction after the Civil War and how the Southern Baptist Church became the Southern Baptist Church and separated from the Baptist Church because they decided it was the will of God that the Black people should be subservient and that they should be separated forever, and that the white people, white supremacy was the law of the Bible. It's a very upsetting book. It starts out with a story of a lynching where they scheduled it around the church service so that the church members could go.
Right.
And they burned the person to death, and they cut off his fingers so that people had souvenirs to take with them. It's a very, very upsetting book, but I know that stuff happened.
Yeah,
and
that's I'm just going to say the next video, which we'll watch, is where Tisby lifts up the very thing you just described, the Southern Baptist Church being formed out of this time, and the divisions in other churches, mainly Presbyterian and Presbyterian, and it'll pick up how Christians went there with that. But yeah, the stuff that went on was just incredible on behalf of the church. Nick, go ahead.
One other point I would make is that the courts during the antebellum period, where they're talking about, you know, the Supreme Court or state courts, were also reinforcing segregation. You know, the Dred Scott decision was basically, again, reinforcing the idea that Black people were inferior to white. But ironically, years later, it would be the Supreme Court with some of its decisions that would help to get rid of separate but equal facilities and say that all facilities had to be equal and all schools had to be equal. So where the courts were at one time very confused, and they were trying to set up compromises, like you could have one free state for every, slave state. They got clearer as time went on to make sure that those things were corrected.
Yeah, it was a long time before that took place, and Dred Scott is another thing that Tisby brings up in the upcoming video to talk about some of the events that really led to the outbreak of the Civil War. But you're right, Nick, the Constitution, and it's already been mentioned, the 3/5, compromise, which was really fascinating because the South wanted the slaves counted for representation as numbers for their representatives, but didn't want them taxed. And the North was, no, and so they ended up with the 3/5 compromise to try to, abide with, both sides of the arguments. Well, okay, we're not going to give you full representation for those folks. And that was the dirty compromise, which was another part of the constitutional development, which was in the clause when certain states said, okay, we'll ratify the Constitution only if you give us 20 years, 2 more decades where you can't talk about this again. And so then it was as Nick said, Missouri Compromise. Okay, we'll let Missouri come in so long as you admit Maine. We'll try to keep the balance between slave and free. And again, what that did was postpone any decent conversation about this. And that, along with the Fugitive Laborer Clause, which doesn't say slave, but everybody knew who's a fugitive laborer, but an enslaved person. So, Margaret, I see your hand up, and then I see Jane too.
So when we talk about the psychological damage that this evil, wrought on the enslaved, I also believe that it causes severe psychological damage to the enslaver. And I'm thinking about the children. When I read Frederick Douglass's autobiography, I just thought, what would it be to be a young child listening to people being whipped and tortured and hurt? And I think that how do they kill that feeling of empathy and that natural identification with someone else to be able to override that when they see their parents and their family doing that to another human being? So I think that there was a lot of psychological damage both ways. It was just a horrible, horrible thing altogether.
Yeah. Jane?
I was just going to comment, and I don't really have an answer to it, but this whole idea of compromise and how our own Constitution was based on compromise and the founding of this nation. I mean, people, they were desperate to form this new nation, this new country, and it involved this significant element of compromise to great detriment to many people. And so when it's fascinating and interesting, and I think challenges us to think about when we say, well, we need to compromise, how do you look at that compromise and how do you discern what is in the best interest of compromising? So that's just a thought I had regarding this.
Yeah, I think, and you have to lower your own hand so that you guys, that way we can, otherwise you stay up there. Tisby talks about the fact that that word keeps showing up, which is obviously clear, that it's so foundational to what he's talking about. And the fact that compromise often means something very positive. It's negotiation, mediation, it's finding some common agreement as parties. And it is interesting because as we were reflecting on what took place in our nation's capital recently, and I want to say, I never want to say that insurrection is always inappropriate. This nation's beginning was an insurrection, and it wasn't a group of people who were seeking to compromise. Maybe they had been trying to compromise with England, but and there's, wasn't compromise. It was a decided, no, we're, taxation without representation, a variety of things. So I think it's interesting to, as you said, the challenge of discerning, at what point do you compromise on certain things for the greater good? And yet clearly Tisby would say, that as Ernie alluded to the economy, there were a lot of people who were probably compromised with, gosh, if we change this, my factory will close and we won't have any, money, and I mean, you know, people compromise for a multitude of reasons, and Tisby just finds it incredulous that people like, you know, was mentioned by others, that the brutality that they witnessed, and the destruction of families and lives, and Christians who chose to ignore, you know, family separation and inhumanity and beatings because for whatever reason, and whether it's just outright denial or, but yeah, compromise is just a huge, yeah, Ernie or Gabrielle, one of you. Unmute.
Got it. I think a very good illustration of this business of compromising over the Constitution was demonstrated in the movie. I think it was called 1776. It was agonizing that they had to do that, but to get it to pass, they had to include that language or make it that way.
Right.
I remember them really agonizing, the characters in that. I think I got the right title.
Yeah.
It's long, it's old movie.
I think I want to move us on because we got another video to watch and give you a chance to reflect on that. But I think his comments on you know, the blacks were victimized, but not victims, and the fact that the strength that was there. He talks at one point where he says, you know, I'm not surprised at the slavery of the time. I'm surprised that blacks kept the faith, and because of what they saw from their Christian overseers. And yet the faith was part of what upheld them. The resistance, I had no idea, you know, they were breaking tools and setting fires on the plantation to try to, you know, disrupt. And obviously, if you've seen, you know, one of the movies includes that slave rebellion where they took up arms against their owner. The paternal Christianity was an interesting, you know, way of talking about it, and that blacks would essentially be perpetually children, and the desire to keep them in worship together with them, in part because, you know, they didn't want them hearing all of Scripture. You can imagine there weren't a whole lot of preachers preaching on the release of the slaves from Egypt, which in black churches has been a core story of Scripture for, you know, forever, because of the sense of liberation that comes. And like the black church he talked about in the beginning, the Episcopal church that filed to, you know, become a part of the denomination. No, you can't, because, you know, you just don't have the stuff it takes to have representation in our body. The Mother Emanuel Church, anybody know what church that is? It's the church in Charleston, South Carolina, where the shooting took place a number of years ago. Mother Emanuel Church was founded in 1817, and it's Mother Emanuel Church. It's actually Emmanuel, but they call it Mother Emanuel because it is the mother of virtually all the black churches in the South. And the city began to make new rules. Blacks could only meet in daylight, which of course didn't help them with work hours. There had to be a majority white membership in a church, which made it difficult. The officials of the church were arrested, beaten, and lashed and fined. And the church, as he mentions, eventually burned down. But that church continues today to exist. The way in which the church was oppressed. One of the other things he mentioned was the American Colonization Society. And for those of you who journeyed along with Gordon McCoskey a little over a year ago in his class and talked about this great plan to, well, let's get rid of these people because we're never going to live together, even in 1,000 years. So let's colonize Liberia with them, send them all back on ships. The reality was, by that time, none of those slaves had ever been to Africa. They'd been born in America, and they want to, you know, it's like, and when we send them there, they will Christianize Africa. And won't that be wonderful? I mean, it was just, again, the paternalistic, we know what's best for you and best for us. So, okay, I'm going to move on to our next video, and I just need to get it up here. And let me share my screen, and we'll look at the next one. Here we go. Oh, I forgot to click on the sound. There we go.
The Civil War ripped the nation into Union and Confederate forces. But you know, the battles for the Civil War didn't just happen in places like Shiloh and Gettysburg. In many ways, the Civil War was a battle over the Bible, too. Historian Mark Knoll writes in his book, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, and he talks about Lincoln, and Lincoln gives an address during his presidency toward the end of the war. And Lincoln captures the dichotomy of understandings of the Bible between Union and Confederates by saying both Union and Confederates read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered, and that of neither has been answered fully. The question was, for many people, was God on the side of the Union or the Confederacy? Well, one example in the Bible helps illuminate that question. In Joshua 5, it says that Joshua asked the commander of the Lord's army, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And the angel of the Lord answered him and said, "No, but I am the commander of the Lord's army." The idea is that God's not on either of these human-made sides. God is for God's self. But when it came to the Civil War, on whose side was God, the Union or the Confederates? It depends on who you ask. There were competing biblical interpretations, and they ricocheted like bullets across the landscape of the church. So in this segment, I want to briefly recount some of the events leading up to the Civil War. I want to unpack this concept of sectionalism, and particularly explain some of the theological justifications put forth in support of slavery and the Confederacy. This section also describes the schism that happened between every major Protestant denomination, the Methodists, the Baptists, and Presbyterians, over the issue of slavery. And throughout this conflict, Christians of both Union and Confederate forces believed that God was on their side. We'll see how that plays out. Now, before we get going, two facts you have to understand about the Civil War. The Civil War was America's deadliest war, and it remains so to this day. Between 650,000 and 850,000 died. That came because this happened right at the influx of technological innovations, which made guns and cannons more deadly. But up to 2/3 of all who died from disease. They were in stuffy tents and they had poor sanitation in their camps, so the soldiers died of dysentery and typhoid fever, pneumonia, smallpox, and gangrene. But you see, over time, the context and the causes of the Civil War have been obscured. What we must know about the Civil War are two facts in particular. Number one, the Civil War was fought over slavery. And don't let anyone tell you different. A lot of people like to say it was fought over states' rights. Well, sure, in a sense, it was fought over states' rights. But the state's right to do what? Hold slaves is what the Confederates were arguing. And people at the time knew this quite well. Just read the articles of secession of states like South Carolina and Mississippi. The second fact we need to realize is that tens of thousands of Christians fought to preserve and defend slavery. We're talking about compromise here and the color of compromise and the American church's complicity in racism. And so we have to take account of the fact that for the soldiers of the Confederacy, they were fighting and even dying to preserve the institution of race-based chattel slavery. Now listen, there were other factors for sure, but the main issue still had to do with the protection and expansion of slaveholding as an institution. Now, during the war, everyone knew this, and it was really only later, especially with the rise of the lost cause mythology, which I'll talk about, did people begin to obscure the salience of slavery to the Civil War. Now, the church, which has this command from the Bible to love God and love your neighbor as yourself, they failed to see Black people as their neighbor and fought and died to preserve the enslavement of other image bearers. And furthermore, they justified their stances through what they thought was righteous indignation and a slanted reading of the Bible and what they thought was divine permission to hold Black people in captivity. In other words, they justified their beliefs through scripture. But the antebellum way of life had to fall, and the Civil War was the sledgehammer that knocked it down. As we talk about the Civil War, let's do a little bit of historical context so that we understand the causes and consequences. There are a lot of things that led up to the Civil War, really over decades, but there are 5 events in particular. Number 1 is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which enforced laws to say that if someone escaped from slavery to freedom, that person could and should be returned to the plantation where they came from, which again, like the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, meant that no place in the country was safe for a Black person. A second event was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which is again sort of this balancing act and this compromise between slave and free states and which ones would be which. Another important decision is the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which I'll talk about further in detail, and John Brown's raid in 1859, which frightened slave owners because here's an example of armed insurrection. And lastly, the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was for many the last and final straw. Let's highlight just a couple of those events. Let me talk about Dred Scott. Dred Scott was born enslaved in Virginia in 1795. Now, he labored for his enslaver in free states. He would follow his slave owner and do work with him in these free states, the territories of Illinois and Wisconsin, for instance. And Dred Scott's reasoning was that since he had gone to these free states and worked, that he should also be free. The male slave owner died, and Dred Scott sued to have his mistress let him buy his freedom and that of his wife and child, but she didn't let him, so he went to court. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. But Judge Roger Taney wrote the majority opinion. In that majority opinion, which ruled against Dred Scott, he said Black people were, quote, an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race. He went on, Judge Taney, to say that Black people had no right which white men were bound to respect. This meant that Black people had no recourse in the courts and no rights as citizens. That was one event that precipitated the Civil War. Another was the election of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Lincoln was a Republican, but don't think 21st century Republican. There was a party realignment many, many years ago. And so in this time, the Republicans were generally on the side of abolition and the Union. Now, Lincoln, who's been hailed as the great emancipator, even by Black people, was far from a racial egalitarian, especially prior to the Civil War. In fact, he objected to the expansion of slavery, but he wasn't interested initially in actually abolishing slavery. And he certainly didn't advocate for civil or social equality of Black people. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, Lincoln said, "I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and Black races." Doesn't sound like much of a great emancipator there. But the election of Abraham Lincoln told officials in slaveholding states that their time was running short and they had to do something. And that's one of the causes that led them to secede. Back to this point about the Civil War being fought over slavery. If anyone has any doubts, look at what South Carolina, the first state to secede, said. In its documents, it said those non-slaveholding states, meaning the Union, have assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions and have denied the rights of property established in the 15 states recognized by the Constitution. Beyond just the political factors, people in the Confederacy saw slavery as a moral and a spiritual issue too. Folks in the South criticized northern states because they denounced as sinful the institution of slavery, and Confederate leaders were saying, no, it's not sinful. Also, if you had any doubts that the Civil War was fought over slavery, Mississippi and the Articles of Secession say our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Now remember the Chattel Principle, the turning people into property principle, and the Mississippi Articles of Secession saying that slavery was the greatest material interest in the world. But it goes on and it elaborates about the presumed inferiority of Black people. The articles say none but the Black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun, as if there's some biological bent or disposition of Black people towards slavery that uniquely suits them to the institution. Now, the splits we're talking about in the Civil War were more than just regional splits over North and South. They were also ecclesiastical splits. And so the Methodists, Presbyterians, and Baptists all split over the issue of slavery, again, along sectional lines, North and South. So let's start with the Methodists. And it was founded by John Wesley, who himself was against slavery. But as the denomination grew in the United States, it also grew more socially conservative, especially on this issue of slavery. So for instance, in 1844, the Methodist General Conference split along sectional lines, and the anti-slavery vote actually won. In a 110-69 vote, Methodists decided to censure their bishop, James Osgood Andrew, as long as he continued to hold slaves. Basically, they were saying you can't be a bishop in good standing and a slaveholder as well. Andrew and his allies withdrew from the MEC to form their own convention, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, or MECS, and they allowed their bishops to practice slavery. So the Methodists split over slavery. But the Baptists, too, followed a similar course. Like Methodists, initially they left the decision about slaveholding to lower levels, not in terms of regions, but individual congregations. So we talked in the previous session about 1790s and the Baptist General Convention there. Like Methodists, Baptists initially left the decision to lower levels, in this case of Baptists at the congregational level. But also, like the Pharisees of the Bible, some of the Baptists in the South wanted to test Northern Baptists. So in 1844, at the Georgia Baptist Convention, they put forth James E. Reeves as a missionary. Now, Reeves was also a slaveholder. Missionaries had to be approved by the Home Mission Society, and this council, this committee, the HMS, they had to decide whether to accept him, a slaveholder, as a missionary. And if they accepted him, they would also tacitly be endorsing slavery for the whole denomination, and to reject him would reveal a bias toward anti-slavery. So they tried to avoid the question altogether, and they said, resolved, that it is not expedient to introduce the subjects of slavery or anti-slavery into our deliberations, nor to entertain applications to which they are introduced. In other words, they didn't want to get baited into this debate. But Baptists in the South didn't leave it alone. This time from Alabama, they submitted another resolution. And this was more straightforward in the demand that the National Convention clearly state its position on whether slaveholding was a sin. Was it truly a matter of indifference for congregations to decide? Or did slaveholding have moral gravity to make a denomination-wide declaration? Well, this time the Home Mission Society responded more directly. They said, if, however, anyone should offer himself as a missionary having slaves and should insist on retaining them as his property, we could not appoint him. And they went on to say, one thing is certain, we can never be a party to any arrangement which would imply approbation or approval of slavery. So in May 1845, Baptists in the South split from their northern neighbors, and you get the birth of the Southern Baptist Convention. There's one more split I want to talk about, this time with the Presbyterians. They were the last ones to split in the early 1860s. And again, this was over an issue of slavery as well. Gardner Spring was a minister, a Presbyterian minister of Brick Presbyterian Church in New York City. As the Civil War approached, he aligned himself with abolitionists. And in 1861, he proposed what is called the Gardner Spring Resolutions. The resolution said this: "It is the duty of the ministry and churches under its care to do all in their power to promote and perpetuate the integrity of these United States, and to strengthen and uphold and encourage the federal government." So you see, Gardner Spring wanted Presbyterians to clearly align with the Union and the anti-slavery cause against the rising tide of the Confederacy. Now, Presbyterians in the South saw this as a direct attack on them, and they opposed the idea that allegiance to the Union could be a condition of Presbyterian membership. So they viewed separation as the only option. Part of the problem was that Christian abolitionists had an issue when advocating for the end of slavery. You see, if they wanted to use the Bible never explicitly repudiates slavery. Indeed, many of the godliest people who Christians look up to as an example, they held slaves themselves according to the biblical record. Now, Southern Christians exploited this fact to defend American race-based chattel slavery. Not only did the Bible not condemn slavery, but it actually provided guidelines for the regulation and practice of enslavement. So Southern slaveholders challenged abolitionists to cite chapter and verse where the Bible explicitly condemned slavery as wrong. And therefore, the Civil War actually became a battle of how to interpret the Bible. For example, Southern Methodist preacher J.W. Tucker wrote in 1862, "Your cause is the cause of God." He's talking to the Confederates. "The cause of Christ, of humanity. It's a conflict of truth with error, of Bible with Northern infidelity, of pure Christianity with Northern fanaticism." It made acceptance of race-based chattel slavery a requirement of biblical orthodoxy. In other words, if you want to be a good Christian who believed the Bible, then you had to advocate slavery. This was put forth very eloquently in a theological work by a man named Robert Louis Dabney. He was a Southern Presbyterian minister, and he directly served General Stonewall Jackson. And he wrote a book called A Defense of Virginia and Through Her of the South, which was published just after the Civil War in 1867. In that book, he used passages from the Old and New Testament to explain why supposedly the North got it wrong on slavery and why the South's defense of slavery was justified. He said, "Was it nothing that this black race, morally inferior, should be brought into close relations with a nobler race," meaning white people? Dabney said that black people tend toward lying, theft, drunkenness, laziness, and waste if left on their own. He then went on to explain the supposed benefits of slavery. It introduced Africans to Christianity. And he says, "And above all, was it nothing that enslaved blacks should be brought by the relation of servitude," meaning slavery, "under the conscience and Christian zeal of a Christian people," meaning white people. You see, in Dabney's mind, the gentle ministrations of the whip had the salutary effect of commending Christianity to black people. Never mind the fact that Christianity had long been in Africa prior to that, and perhaps there could have been more effective ways to evangelize non-Christian people than through enslavement. Now, had Dabney personally experienced slavery, he might have come to a different conclusion about it as an evangelistic mechanism. As we talk about the Civil War and Christian defenses of slavery and fighting on the side of the Confederacy, it should give every citizen and Christian in the United States pause to consider how strongly ingrained the support for slavery in our country was. People believed in the enslavement of black people so strongly that they were willing to form another country, fight a war, and die to defend it. And throughout it all, Christian leaders and lay people alike looked to the Bible to justify their pro-slavery stance. And they made sophisticated theological arguments for it and believed that God was on their side. The Civil War paints a vivid picture of what inevitably happens when the American church is complicit in racism and willing to deny the teachings of Jesus to support an immoral evil institution.
So, again, pretty wide swath. The comments about the things that really kicked off the Civil War, sort of key events, the description of splits in churches and how churches responded. And there's a lot of history there. You could certainly fill in some gaps there. I think one of the things I found most significant was this, the Civil War was fought over slavery. I remember one of the first times I moved to a church in Virginia and was immediately told, of course, that I think I had arrived on the day that Lincoln was shot, and they let me know that that was the anniversary of that event was the day I arrived at that church. And someone mentioned, was states' rights. It was states' rights, Don. It had nothing to do with slavery. Tisby wants to make it very clear. Yeah, it was states' rights to do what? To have slaves. So thoughts or reflections or learnings that came out of this for you? Yes, Sue Kelly. I lost you, Sue. All right, well, Sue's working on that. Let me see, any other hands? Betsy.
Several thoughts from the last segment. You're talking, and I liked, Meg, I like what you said about the whole idea. It's intergenerational trauma that we're witnessing today. That all these things that have happened, the brutality, the horribleness, the removal of children that you were speaking about. That's all retained by those generational stories that are still in Black families today, and that's part of the rage and the anger and the hurt, and that's a tough thing. Second thing is, it sounds to me, some of the things he was talking about, I don't know how much you heard it, but I heard an awful lot of what the rhetoric has been lately in the stuff he was talking about. And that scares me, because this, even though the Civil War was ended, I don't think it was over. And so we're bearing some of that generational stuff too, that we have to come up with some answers for, or some beginnings of answers for. And hopefully, that has not stopped, and that rhetoric has not stopped. It's scary, isn't it? So I just wanted to say those couple of things.
Good. Thanks, Betsy. Yes, Sue, you want to try again?
Let me know if you can hear me.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm so glad we're doing this. And one thing that comes to mind for me is, the more oppressed, the more depressed, the more abused, the more beaten up by life and society you are, the stronger God is for you. And that the Black church did rise. And God was, as always, working in the lives of people that reached out to him. And I have just such an awesome admiration for, the seeds that were, that sprouted and blossomed within the Black people that were slaves, to not give up, to continue to seek what was just and right. And even if while pretending to be very slow or, doing all of the other things that they needed to do. I am just in awe that expressions like go along to get along, and a lot of the things that I've heard through the years just are resonating so loudly now with learning more of what abuse we have inflicted upon each other and the Bible and the understanding of the Bible. That's it.
Thanks. Yeah, the challenge of scripture when you're working with broad strokes of God tells us to love our neighbor versus the proof texting of, well, this is how you're supposed to treat your slave. So obviously the Bible implies it's okay. And it was a very difficult debate across theological lines, biblically. Yeah, Janet.
Yes, there were two thoughts. One of them is that I had the chance to do some study of the Civil War with my daughter's college work. And I don't think we should get the idea that it was strictly a North-South thing, because we did some research of newspapers in rural Pennsylvania, and they didn't necessarily oppose slavery. They might have, joined up to fight with Lincoln, but it didn't necessarily mean that everybody in the North was a good guy and an abolitionist and against slavery, and everybody in the South was a bad guy and in favor of slavery. And we, growing up in Pennsylvania, I always had the feeling like, oh, well, we were the good guys. We won, we opposed slavery, and we didn't have the racism that the awful South had. But this was something that was spread throughout the population, throughout the United States, not just North and South. And I don't think that the Civil War would have happened if they hadn't taken the next step for secession, just because, there was enough, feeling. I mean, there were a lot of people in rural Pennsylvania who were related to people in the South, and there were families that fought against each other in the war. So we can't necessarily give ourselves the benefit of saying that we're the good guys. And it carries through to today. And the other thing that hits me is in comparison, I think maybe Sue was the one who brought this up, with the or maybe it was Betsy, with the what we're dealing with here today, I think, is the fear of loss of entitlement. And it was the same thing at the Civil War. They were afraid of losing the slaves, but also afraid of losing that feeling of entitlement, because, you think of the young people who were growing up in families where their parents had slaves and their grandparents had slaves. They had the feeling that, well, of course you can do this because my family's always done it, and so it must be okay. And so they felt like they were entitled, and the entitlement carries through to today. And people figured it was okay because the churches said it was okay. And we still see that with some of the, mostly evangelical leaders today, with this idea that, that there is entitlement, and that, and refuse to come out against racism. That, there is a fear factor that, I have something and I'm going to lose it. And that was true in the Civil War of losing slaves. But today it's the idea that, well, I'm a white person or a white male, and I have something today and I'm going to lose it. And then the fear incites people to do things that, you would think that, normal rational people shouldn't do. So anyway.
Yeah. Like that Episcopal church in New York that he first mentioned, there was a fear from the convention that they would have representation in the body. And immediately, we'll get into it in the next session about Jim Crow laws, but for a period of time, there were, blacks holding significant office. And then the fears of representation and what that might mean for the country, change things. Jane, I see your hand up.
I just had a question, Don. It wasn't in the video, but it was in the chapter. With the biblical interpretation of Noah's son and
Ham and
Ham
Shem,
being
yeah,
that genealogical thing that
right.
that blacks came from Ham and whites came from the other son lineage. Where did that interpretation come from?
That's been around for for a long time. It has sort of a demographic roots. For those of you who don't know, it's the story of Noah and his son discovers Noah naked, and the other two go in and cover up the father because the one didn't cover him up right away. It's called the curse of Ham, but it's not really, Ham doesn't get cursed. Actually, Canaan, Ham's son, gets cursed, and there are people who would say that the curse was done when Canaan, the land of Canaan, got taken over. But there are folks who, and I honestly don't know, Jane, it's sort of origin, like if there's a real, tight origin, but that one of the sons, was, the basic father, if you will, of the Jews. The son was the father of the whites, and the other son was the father of the blacks. And the demography of that is pretty, well, at least all of the whites going back to the one son of another, it's just absurd. So I don't know its origins, but it's been around a long time.
Yeah, I just found that I'd heard this, heard that argument that was been used for ages, but I didn't really know where they kind of came up with this racial divide with it. So,
right.
Thank
Don?
you.
Yeah.
Kathy Woodman.
Hi, Kathy.
Hi. So I just have two thoughts that have kept popping in and out of my mind. In talking about one of those compromises where they compromise that we're not going to bring this up again for 20 years, that this is basically, it sounds to me like those people were putting it out of their time of responsibility. In other words, they probably wouldn't be the ones that would be making the decisions 20 years later. So it's an abdication of responsibility and accountability, which I feel that a lot of our inability in Congress to make any forward movements comes from this, no, not on my watch type thing, as opposed to, no, I'm in here to own, I have a responsibility to address the issues at hand. And then just the other thing is, so I'm a Southerner. I grew up in the deep South, got caught in desegregation and moved to Pennsylvania in 1983. And I remember thinking when I moved to Pennsylvania, oh my gosh, so now I'm going to be in a totally accepting environment of all people. And I'm in 83, I moved, I did engineering work for DuPont, was in Glasgow, Delaware, at one of their facilities. And the first 2 weeks was the most eye-opening of my life as far as racism and biased against people of color. Sitting in the lunchroom, I was like an only female, sitting in the lunchroom, listening to the conversations around me. And I would have thought that it would have been in the early 60s when I was living in Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana. So the comment from somebody else about the North people, we're the good guys, and the South. I grew up in the deep South, and there were lots of people that were good people that did not believe that people of color were below them. And that's how, I was raised and surrounded by those people. Yes, there were racists, but it wasn't 100%. So
I think I'll make one comment that there are, it's not uncommon for people, if you want to want to kick the can down the road, sometimes just to preserve doing some of the other work that you think you need to do. And I watched the Presbyterian Church as it wrestled with same-gender marriage and with ordination of avowed practicing homosexuals. And it kept coming up at our National Assembly, and it would consume the work of the body to the point that people felt like they couldn't do any other ministry. And it's like, okay, no more overtures on this for a period of time, just because it was like, and others who would say, no, this is, this is the justice issue of, and it's, it can be a challenge, in any significant place where people are trying to say, let's not let this overtake us, and others saying, well, that's exactly what it should be doing. I'm aware of our time. It's a minute till 1, and I'm glad to stay on, but I know there's, I don't want to, if people need to drop off, please do. I see Cheryl's hand up. Let me call her Cheryl and Ted.
Can you hear me? Anyway,
Yep.
Cheryl Strand, I just wanted to mention those of us that went to the speaker from Princeton in 1911 in Coatesville, there was a lynching. So the prejudice wasn't that far from us. And then people, after they lynched him, they burnt his body. People took bones and things as souvenirs from this man's body to keep. And so the prejudice was in our area. And another thing is Presbyterian Church near the Capitol where Lincoln went. Lincoln and the pastor were working out together. The pastor, their Presbyterian pastor, was helping him write an amendment to buy all the slaves freedom. And that never, the Civil War started because of the shooting of the one person, and things got out of hand before Lincoln was able to propose this buying of all the slaves in the US to get their freedom. Those were the 2 points I wanted to make. And the letter's still in the church and the Presbyterian Church if you want to go see it. Ted, it was
it's in their archives.
It's the
we saw it when we went on a tour.
But what's the name of the church?
New York Avenue Presbyterian Church.
New York, yeah. I saw one question about church splits, and John answered, yes, there have been plenty of other splits. The Presbyterian Church split at the beginning of the Civil War. Unlike Episcopals and Lutherans who reunited shortly after the war, Presbyterians took 122 years to get back together. But one of the interesting, challenging pieces of that, and I was in the South when that vote took place, actually the vote was closer in the Northern Church regarding reunion of the two denominations, because the churches in the North were concerned that the African-American congregations in the South, which had been their own governing bodies and had their own ministries, would be absorbed and become, just really, really limited voices in the presbyteries of the South. So that reuniting of churches was not a simple, oh, let's all get back together. There were real concerns for, congregations that had life and ministry that were going to end up being, once again, there were Black presbyteries in the South, and now there were going to be 2 or 3 Black churches in a presbytery of 90 white churches. And where they once had, an authority over their life and their ministry in a region, now we're going to be really kind of the, to use the language, back of the bus in white presbyteries. It's been challenges as we've renegotiated churches coming back together. Yeah, Nick, and then I'll close with a prayer and anybody else can stay on.
Yeah, I wanted to build on Janet Colton's point and Kathy's. I went to a public high school in the 1960s called Andrew Jackson High School in Southeast Queens. The racism was unbelievable even then. We had white coaches who would, I would say, abuse a lot of the Black students. and treat them like they were property, to the point that there were fistfights between black students and white teachers. The violence in the school got to be so bad that they had to put a permanent policeman on every floor of the school. There were 4 floors, 3,000 students, and 4 cops permanently assigned to each floor of that building. Racism in New York was very much alive, even in the 1960s, even 70s and 80s. If you look back at who they were hiring on the police departments and in the fire departments, very few blacks were being hired. I mean, the racism was in the North, as you know, Janet pointed out, is probably as much, if not more, than in the South. In the North, it was just hidden. It was kept under the surface. It kind of festered until there were explosions all over the place. You remember the riots in Harlem and stuff. So I think these are very important points to keep in mind. It wasn't just the South that had racism. It was in the North as well. We hid it more. We were more subtle about it, but it was very much alive, and violence was very prevalent, even in the 60s and 70s in New York over racism.
Yeah, I don't think there's anybody on this, or there shouldn't be, who assumes it wasn't. Clearly, by governing standards and what states were fighting for, there was a northern southern division. But people, I mean, the cross was burned in my neighborhood in somebody's front yard when I was in high school. So it's and that was in Ohio. All right, let me close this with a prayer, and feel free to drop off or hang out if you want. Holy God, we're grateful that you continue to teach us and remind us that in these questions, you only take one side, and that is the side of all humanity, and your desire for your image bearers, no matter what their color, to be fruitful and loving and successful and helpful and grateful, and everything we can be. So continue to melt our hearts, to erase the things that we've inherited that are not of you, prejudices and attitudes that still hold us fast, and even, if you will, enslave us to things that are wrong. And bless us as we continue to ponder, and give us strength and energy for the rest of the tasks for the day. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Thanks all.
Just for next week, read 6 and 7 if you're reading the book.